Immediately, of course, after the war was ended, the Russian government announced that it was recognizing the independence of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And from what one knows, this wasn't something that the foreign ministry necessarily knew very much about in advance. Russia apparently must have expected, or maybe expected, that some of its allies, partners in the post-Soviet space would recognize the independence of these two entities. Not one country did, including Belarus, which is, seen to be very close to Russia. And the only countries that did were Nicaragua, Venezuela, and then subsequently a few islands in the Pacific atolls, Nauru, Vanuatu, and I think at the beginning Hamas did. Anyway, there is no international recognition for these two entities. And talks have been going on in Geneva since the end of the war. There is a diplomatic process, and those talks have been going on between Russia, the Europeans. It was France that negotiated the ceasefire and the deal in the beginning, and the United States. But they're really not going anywhere, and one periodically hears calls that, they should be abandoned. They're not achieving anything. And I think most people would agree that Russia has violated the terms of the ceasefire, at least as the West understands it, by keeping a substantial troop presence in South Ossetia. And of course, it does have troops in Abkhazia too. When the new Georgian government came to power, that is to say the new Prime Minister, Bidzina Ivanishvili, and the Georgian Dream Party, after these rather surprising Georgian elections last fall, Mr. Ivanishvili said, we want to move closer to Russia. And there have been some moves. The Russians have now lifted their ban on the import of Georgian wines, which they introduced a couple of years before the war. And they've also now lifted their ban on the importation of Borjomi mineral water, two staples that used to be of the Russian diet. And there have been talks and rumors that the relationship is improving. There's a dialogue going on, but nobody really knows what that means. Georgia has also, the new Georgian government, the new Prime Minister has said, well, Georgia also wants to continue its dialogue with the European Union and wants to be integrated into Europe and the Euro-Atlantic space. Mr. Ivanishvili is a rather mysterious character. He is a billionaire. He made an enormous amount of money in Russia, and this obviously has led to questions about exactly what his relationship with the Russian government and the Russian political elite is, and I'm not sure that we know the answers to that. So what one sees now are somewhat improved atmospherics between Georgia and Russia, but nothing too substantial at the moment. And maybe one has to await the outcome of the presidential elections in Georgia, which are in November of 2013. We don't know who the next president will be. That president will have diminished powers because they've changed the constitution. But maybe there would be a rapprochement with Russia. But I think we also have to understand that the Russian-Georgian relationship has always been very problematic, and that when Shevardnadze was in power, it was also an uneasy relationship. And so there are, if you like, structural and historical reasons why this isn't a close relationship and why it's problematic. Now, it doesn't mean it has to be as bad as it was under Mikhail Saakashvili. But I think public opinion polls show that even though Georgians would prefer an improved relationship with Russia, they retain a healthy suspicion of what Russian intentions are vis-a-vis Georgia. I think it's very unlikely that any other country is going to recognize the independence of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. I think it's equally unlikely for the foreseeable future that Russia will suddenly change its mind on this and say, well, we're going to de-recognize them. I mean, that would go against the pattern of everything we know, diplomacy in general, and particularly Russian foreign policy. So it seems to me that going forward, you could have this kind of stalemate for a very long time. The analogy is sometimes made with the Turkish Cypriot part, of Cyprus, and the fact that that's not recognized. There are other entities in the world that consider themselves independent and that most other countries don't recognize. You could, however, see maybe an improvement of relations between these entities and some other, European countries, although everyone's very wary. What we do know is that Abkhazia has put out feelers to the Europeans and has made it known that it would like to have relations with other countries and that doesn't want to be excessively dependent on Russia. South Ossetia is a little bit more complicated because, of course, there is a North Ossetia. There are closer ties with and North Ossetia is in the Russian Federation. So I think it's very hard to see any change in this going forward, and it will really mean that Russia bears the financial responsibility for these entities. And interestingly enough, we've seen in elections in both of them that the Moscow preferred candidate hasn't always won. I mean, there is actually politics going on in both of these entities and this is not completely managed by Russia, but I think their room for maneuver is very limited.